Hi, everyone. My name is Andre Daly. I am the Director of Inclusion at your Grand Rapids Chamber. And I am very excited today to be talking with Dr. David Livermore, who is a mentor, a friend, and one of the leading experts in the area of cultural intelligence. He is the founder and former CEO and president of the CQ Center, located right in here in West Michigan. David, welcome to Inclusion Solutions.
Thank you, Andre.
So to get started, why don't you tell our folks a little bit about your CQ journey and how did you get into the CQ arena in the first place?
Yeah, so that's always an interesting question. If you had asked me a couple years ago in a public setting to describe my cultural intelligence journey, I probably would have taken a very safe and succinct approach to say I was in a role to lead the international division of an organization, was doing a lot of work internationally, and just had a very practical need to figure out how to navigate working with so many different cultures. And that's true, it's just not the more nuanced, complex, personal side of the CQ journey. And I would say that that fuller version, well, I'll still give you the executive summary of it, is I'm a dual citizen of US and Canada, so even as a kid I was fascinated by different cultures, albeit relatively simplistic differences that I was looking at as a kid, of different money and different ways of saying things. And then actually I was an aspiring missionary. 11 years old, I said I was going to be a missionary to Brazil. I had the next 20 years mapped out that my parents kind of smirked at, etc. And I really think that was a key part that gave birth to my interest in different cultures. Ironically, it was some of my earliest short-term missions and study abroad experiences that also began to challenge my assumptions, birth in me the seeds of cultural intelligence. And a quick example, I can remember one of my first experiences in Peru, and I had sort of been indoctrinated with, I as a 19-year-old had way more education than these 40 and 50-year-olds I was going to be interacting with. So I kind of viewed these natives, as they were called, as these relatively ignorant, simplistic. And then at 19, I'm suddenly talking to this 45-year-old, village leader along the Amazon, and I'm like, this guy is way smarter than me, has thought through life way more than I have. And there's a million other illustrations like that that have unfolded for the last 30 years. And so kind of an ongoing journey, in part questioning if my faith had any relevance then to this whole journey of how I exist in this complex world, and then eventually coming back to saying, wait, no, there's a place for me still to be a person of faith, value, and conviction, but to also allow other people to have that and realize that there's something rich for me to learn in that. So might be a longer answer than you were looking for, but nowadays I'm choosing to be a bit more vulnerable in talking about my own journey toward cultural intelligence that is very much ongoing.
Yeah, to piggyback on that a little bit, I think one of the things that I'm recognizing, particularly here in West Michigan, that I've been trying to share with folks, is that you don't have to actually go anywhere anymore to experience that world that calls you into a broader understanding of different cultures, that we have right here in this region a vast variety of different cultural expressions and experiences from different cultural groups and racial ethnic groups. And I think that's one of the reasons that I'm so excited to have you talk about CQ and share it with the participants of Inclusion Solutions.
Yeah, Andre, as you're aware, I spent the last 15 years living in West Michigan and just recently moved from there. But I was actually already engaged in some of the cultural intelligence research before we got there. And one of the assumptions I even had as part of my cultural intelligence journey before moving to West Michigan was like, oh, this is going to be really theoretical to these people. They're not going to understand the importance of cultural intelligence. I actually was challenged by that. As someone who grew up in New York, coming to West Michigan, I actually found in some ways there was an increased appetite because people were saying, hey, like maybe I haven't traveled a whole lot, but increasingly we've got international companies that find their home here. And then to your point, like, whoa, this isn't only international differences. What about all these different ethnic backgrounds, generational backgrounds, as well as once we move into differences of sexual orientation and different neurodiversity and places that people fall on the spectrum and on it goes. So yeah, you're exactly right. I had my own assumptions challenged about the relevance to West Michigan when I got there, and I was also pleasantly surprised to see that I found a lot of keen appetite to say, we'd love to learn more about the world that's at our own fingertips, as well as the world that's literally on the other side of the world from us.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was very much gratified to be introduced to CQ by you personally and jumped at it right away. And I was bought in the early days.
Yeah.
So tell our participants on the Inclusion Solutions and update me on how has CQ evolved over those years.
Yeah, you were one of our early adopters, Andre, and really grateful for that. So I would say from the very beginning, 20 some years ago, we always would have said that cultural intelligence is a macro capability that allows you to interact with anyone who comes from a different background. In reality, and probably what you experienced when you went through one of our first certification programs, the vast majority of our application and research was rooted in international differences. So helping companies like Amway, how do you help somebody who might never be getting on the corporate jet, but they're expected to get on a 10 o'clock call with Asia, and how do they interact with their counterparts? So it certainly wasn't all oriented around people flying all over the world, but primarily applied to these international differences. Increasingly, we had organizations in West Michigan and across the globe who were saying, okay, sure, we have those challenges, but we're actually having as many challenges with people who move to West Michigan from Chicago or the Bay Area, or we're dealing with people who maybe they grew up in Grand Rapids, but on different sides of the tracks or from different zip codes or different, political arenas. And so that caused us to say, yeah, like, of course we know it applies to domestic or regional diversity, but we need to get at that too. And now, to this most recent book really emerges from research on saying, and sometimes the biggest challenges we face are people who hold the same passport as us, maybe grew up in the same town as us, maybe grew up in the same household as us, because sometimes we find like people in our own extended family can feel like they're aliens to us in terms of their opinions on very volatile issues around things about politics or reproductive rights or vaccine mandates, and on the list goes. So
sure.
So it has evolved a great deal, and at the risk of patronizing you, I think you saw that earlier on because you weren't as quick to dismiss, well, this is just international. You're going, wait, like you were one of the voices saying, we need to help people understand how this deals with issues of racial inequity right in our own neighborhoods, or socioeconomic, or a number of the other domestic aspects that we deal with in places like West Michigan and really all over the world.
Yeah, in that regard, CQ was really at the vanguard, out front at raising some of the issues of intercultural, intracultural stuff that is going on in business right now, and that is emerging within, as you rightly point out, our communities, our families, and in our workplaces. So was that the motivation for the new book? What prompted you to move in this direction with the new book, Digital, Diverse, and Divided?
Yeah, so certainly in part, just kind of the evolution of how CQ was being applied. I think it was also, I was increasingly being asked by champions of cultural intelligence and some of our own team at the Cultural Intelligence Center, like, when are we going to have the book that makes cultural intelligence more relevant to people who aren't doing international work? And, I would be a little defensive of that. Like, oh, come on, leading with cultural intelligence isn't just about international. Like, yeah, but 9 out of 10 of the examples end up being global. So part of it was me asking that. Also, frankly, it was just my own role as a citizen in the world of watching the increased polarization over the last 5 to 6 years and going, wait, like, cultural intelligence is actually one of the tools that can help with it. It's not the only tool. I'm pretty well aware we need a lot more than just cultural intelligence to help us overcome polarization, but the same kinds of things that I've spent the last 20 years teaching organizations and executives, it was like, these are the same kinds of principles that can help us when we're talking about Donald Trump or Joe Biden or whatever the polarizing topic of the day is. In the last couple of weeks, at least when we're recording this, it's forgiveness of college debt. So what is it this week? By the time this webcast airs, it'll probably be some new thing that'll feel like it's ancient history. So yeah, that really, I think, was the nature of it, of how do we make it relevant for such a time as this.
Absolutely. And I just want to say, I feel this is the book that I needed to engage with in terms of this work, because one of the things that I've encountered in the work that I'm doing with folks is that it's as much big C culture as it is little c culture right now, because we have all these, one of the things that's going on in society that I think the book speaks to is we have microcultures now around everything. And so you can wake up one day and find that within your family, you are a part of one microculture, and other folks in your immediate family are part of another microculture.
Like who would have guessed that we'd be guessing someone's political affiliation based upon whether they're wearing a mask, right?
That's right. That's right. And and we don't have the tools to navigate that. And I think that's one of the great things that was intriguing to me about the new book. When I saw the title and looked at that title and said, yeah, really, that speaks to the time that we are in. So I'm curious, how did you come up with that title, Digital, Diverse, and Divided?
I mean, largely, I'm a pretty pragmatic guy, even though I love research. And so part it was, it was one of the first titles I wrote down when we were brainstorming. It's like, this is just descriptive of the challenge that I want to help address. Right. So yeah, that was in large part. I mean, we also went through a process of kind of connecting with other people, what resonates most. But at the risk, I'm also an eternal optimist. So my pause with the title was, I don't want to be like, digital, diverse, and divided. But with that, like, hey, let's name the way that a lot of us feel, and then let's try and offer, to your point, solutions and tools to it, rather than just, well, that's our fate, so I guess we just have to live with this now.
So let me bounce a couple of things off of you here that I've shared with folks on this webcast. When I think of digital, I think of not just the digital divide, but the fact that we have generational differences in how people engage and relate to the digital world. Is that what you were getting at?
Yeah, and Andre, you're reminding me too, when you emphasize the digital, like part of this also is I wrote this book during COVID, and so suddenly the only way we were interacting with people outside of our family for at least a few weeks and months and years in some parts of the world was through digital mechanisms. So it was also like, how does this polarization like get exacerbated if we're just interacting with colleagues over Zoom or Teams, etc. But yeah, I think there's also a point of the generational and digital divide that happens in terms of our comfort with tools. It's also looking at the landscape of social media and how that's played a role in perpetuating polarization. And again, I've never been a anti-mainstream media or anti-social media. Those are just platforms and mechanisms that are just amplifying what's out there, but that they've added an additional challenge to what's informing our polarization. So I think it's all of those things that are kind of involved in it.
Yeah. So my take on the diversity part of it, or the diverse line, is that I think we are in a time that we are, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, having to engage with a more diverse group of people than at any time in previous history. And part of that is the breakdown of barriers around using the digital space. Right now, I can be talking to you in California, or I can be talking to someone halfway around the world because of the use of digital resources. And so that puts me in contact with and exposure to more diversity than I think has ever been available prior to this time.
Yeah, I agree. And more importantly, research supports that. Like there is increased diversity more than ever before. And I don't want to jump ahead of you, but also the research shows that we are more divided than ever before. This isn't just a feeling. The other thing I was thinking about as you camped out there on the diverse part of the title is the workplace is where we most encounter that diversity, because I can choose to retain in my echo chamber. And because of unconscious bias and all this stuff that you and I know about, like by default, I probably will seek out like kind in my faith community or my neighborhood or the people but at work, I don't have a choice. I have to interact with people who suddenly have very diverse backgrounds. And I think that's what intrigues me as I've watched even the change in the 15 years that I lived in West Michigan, that increasingly individuals were like, okay, I'm now working with people who have very different views than I can't just assume they go to church. I can't just assume they're voting for the same candidate. And then of course, likewise, like I can't just assume that they're, have the same nationality as me, and maybe, if I even invite them out for lunch together, what's an appropriate place to go and what to talk about. And
yeah, and that's really one of the key things I wanted to touch on with you. How do you see CQ being applied to that increasingly diverse workplace environment? What can we, how can we utilize CQ, and how can we learn to navigate that using some of the tools around cultural intelligence?
Yeah, so a couple thoughts on that. In one regard, I would say, if anything, we've probably overemphasized over the last 20 years cultural intelligence as it relates to the workplace. Like that's the vast majority of what we've looked at. How does it help you collaborate on a team? How does it help you, if you are a business person blowing in and out of a lot of different cultures and cities, to at least have some sense of what's going on? As it relates to this big C culture context that we're living in, with all the micro cultures, et cetera, that you referenced. I think it's also, though, giving tools for, as I've already mentioned in our time together, someone who might look just like me, but internally may have a very different perspective. And maybe to speak to the opposite without picking on them, some of your audience will remember when Basecamp a year or two ago put out, an edict that there will be no discussion in the workplace about any sensitive or political issues. And what was it? Something like 30% of people immediately resigned. And, I'm not really here to pick on Basecamp. I understand what they were doing. Like, hey, at work, let's acknowledge that people have different views on these things, so don't even talk about it. We can't not talk about it. It's part of who we are. And we haven't really ventured into the topic of race too much in this conversation yet today, but I mean, here's me, a white guy, telling you this, Andre, but I listened to a lot of friends of color who told me what it was like to suddenly jump on a Zoom call 3 days after the George Floyd murder, and nobody on their team even acknowledged it, and we're just like chit-chatting about what are you doing over the holiday weekend, etc. Like, sure. Haven't even thought about it. So all that to say, like, what cultural intelligence allows you to do is, how are you not scared to bring those up? You might get it wrong. I might say to Andre, how are you feeling about George Floyd? And Andre may say, thank you very much for like profiling me and thinking that I ought to have an opinion on it. Well, guess what? If you actually accuse me of that not being an appropriate question, I think I have thick enough skin that I can take that. But what the book tries to do, and more importantly, what cultural intelligence attempts to do, is rather than starting, as you often so well say, with a deficit of don't even open your mouth, you bigot, but like, no, here's some tools to let's engage in the conversation. You're not always going to get it right. And as it relates to the workplace, guess what? There's all kinds of studies that demonstrate that as you allow people to engage in those conversations, it links to engagement, which links to productivity, which links to the bottom line, etc. So.
And you have just made my day, because you are articulating all the stuff that I try to share with people about how important and why this is important. One of the things that really excited me about the book was I think it set the stage for this conversations about how our familial culture bleeds into the way we engage people in the workplace. In that if we talk a lot about today about being able to create spaces of belonging in the DEI realm, and then we talk about being able to bring your whole self to work, what does that mean if I'm coming from a particular cultural perspective that is reinforced in my familial culture, and then or not reinforced in my familial culture, and then I have to come into this workplace environment that might be either a shock to the system from that in terms of that cultural point of view, or a more stressor in terms of all the things that I now have on my plate. I'm reminded of a situation I was in where someone came to me, a staff person came to me, and I reference this because you shared a little bit about coming from a particular faith perspective, and they said, in my role as director of engagement, are you going to ask me to change my particular religious beliefs to be a part of this organization? And there was that whole anxiety around. Basically, the underlying question was, I don't know how you want me to function in terms of who I am in this workplace environment that I think you're trying to create. And when I suggested to the person that I wanted them to bring that cultural perspective into the workplace and for us to have a conversation about how that integrated into the work that we were doing as an organization, it was kind of like a screeching halt to the conversation, because the idea that could happen hadn't even entered into that person's mind. And so I'm really intrigued and by the way the book makes this dynamic flow into all of these little microcultures and experiences that we have in terms of the connection that we have, and then puts kind of by telling some great stories, by the way, about that reflect the human side of culture, whether it's culture big C or culture little c, and how what CQ really does is, I think, give you an opportunity to tap into that human side of things. That was a long, kind of drawn out question. How would you respond to that and reflect on that in the book?
Yeah, so good, Andre. I mean, in terms of all of what you have there, I have so many thoughts right now. Let me start with one and wade into potentially some controversial territory, but you raised the issue of authenticity, which is one of the holy grails of the DEI work, at least in the US context. And I think from your and my many years of interacting across a variety of topics that you and I are similar, and that we're okay with tension and paradox. And I feel like the authenticity is one of those. That is to say, I fully embrace the importance of bringing that out, where many individuals from underrepresented groups have felt like they have to cloak a core part of their identity, have to learn to speak in a certain way, or wear their hair in a certain way, or cloak that their partner is a same-sex partner, etc. So I'm fully on board with people are going to be much more productive, effective teammates if we allow them to not have to cloak that. The other side of it is, in reality, we're all bringing different versions of ourselves to different settings. There's things that you and I are going to talk about here because it's a public webcast that would be different if you and I were just meeting one-on-one at the coffee shop. So what does authenticity mean? And that's, if it comes back to your illustration of talking with someone from a particular faith perspective, or we think about our own families, like, we all understand that what my family norms are, I can't just walk into the workplace and assume that everyone's going to adjust to that. So I'm fully on board that we need, for a long time, people with my identity, a straight, white, middle-aged guy, has not had to worry too much about being authentic, because the dominant norms of how I behave and act is how the workplace was structured. So I'm going to be a huge advocate for, we need to create space for other people to do that. I just think we need the nuance of it, of saying with cultural intelligence, it's understanding that sometimes I need to bring a little bit less of the real me because it may have a negative impact on you. And if we're all just like, well, you know what? I'm Muslim and I'm going to go right to prayer time right now. Well, I'm Christian, I'm going to do this. Well, I'm an atheist, you all need to shut the hell up or something. Like, well, where's that going to lead us? Like, somewhere we have to develop some shared team norms that we all agree are going to require some flexibility. I think what cultural intelligence does, though, is say for too long, along with a lot of the broader work in diversity, equity, and inclusion, for too long the default has been everybody needs to adapt to the headquarters or needs to adapt to the dominant culture, and how do we really create more space for a diversity of expression. I don't know if that's at all what you were getting at with your question.
No, I think that's perfect, because I think that really speaks to the last part of the title, is that the divided part. And I think it from my seat in the DEI space, that divided is really about the challenge of acknowledging difference and valuing that difference. And we're divided because we really don't know how to engage across difference. And I think that's the piece that is so important in the final analysis that I'm trying to share with people. Yes, it's important to bring your whole self to work, but you need to do that in the context of understanding, as you rightly point out, that your whole self cannot be applied, and your value system cannot be applied to everybody or even every situation with every person that you work with. Mm-hmm. There are times when it's just, you need to pull that back from a cultural standpoint, and not push into particularly necessarily, you talked about George Floyd or the recent killing we had in Grand Rapids, and you know, having someone's, well, how are you doing with that? You know, and to me, as a person of African descent, that's my response is like, you know, all right, back up a little bit. I need to process. Right, and that could be seen that someone could do that and think they're doing all the right things. So checking in with me, but culturally,
if I flip and interview you on that for a second. So what would be the coaching you'd give to someone to say, like, hey, it may affect you differently than me, but I hear you saying don't just assume like you should have a stated opinion on it. So is there an appropriate way to demonstrate, I see you and I see how this may affect you, without the
example? Well, it's really something that I learned from CQ, which is to ask it's not just important to ask questions, it's important to ask the right questions. So instead of, so tell me how you're feeling, right? Do you have something you want to talk about?
With everything going on right now, or
with everything going.
Yeah.
And then, because what that does is, and this I think is also important from a cultural intelligence standpoint, it gives me agency.
That's great.
And I'm allowed to, I can then respond through agency from the cultural perspective that is most significant and important to me at that point in time.
You know, I had a guy ask me just the other day about the "where are you from" question. You and I have both used that wonderful video of the "where are you from," and so this guy was like, okay, so I know you're not a fan of "where are you from" to anyone who looks like they're not yourself, but he's like, but I have high CQ drive. I'm genuinely curious and interested, and he's like, I love to ask my Uber drivers where they're from. He's like, so is it really bad to do that? And again, of course, I said it depends, but it kind of, to your point, I said, maybe there's a slightly different question you could ask. Like, tell me how long you've lived here in San Francisco, or talk to me about, you know, your family or such, rather than coming right out with, you obviously ain't from here, so tell me what you're doing in these parts, kind of thing.
Yeah, it really sets a different tone. that question sets a completely different tone, because it in the vernacular that we use in this space, it sets that person up as an other right away.
Right. Yeah, and to use your other term, as compared to giving them agency. In fact, I sometimes will purposely go the other extreme. And, if I had someone with sounding like an Ethiopian accent driving me in an Uber to the Grand Rapids airport, I might say something like, "No, are you originally from Grand Rapids?" Almost start with the assumption of, hey, maybe.
Yeah.
And sometimes they were like, yeah, my parents moved here and I grew up here, etc.
That's right. And that is a real possibility. In
Your
Grand Rapids.
sons, right?
Yeah, that's right. So those are some of the things that, the ways that I think CQ can be so helpful. So want to move towards wrapping up here. What's the one big takeaway that folks who are watching this should leave this conversation that we've had, which I've thoroughly enjoyed, and I wish we could do more often because you're such a wealth of information and insight. But what's the big takeaway that folks should have from the book and from this conversation about how we can function effectively in a diverse, digital, divided world?
I think it's actually the counterintuitive idea that the best way to overcome our polarization is through our differences, not in spite of them. So to actually use our differences as creative ways to get to solutions. And if I can cheat and take a point A, a sub point to that one big takeaway, the book really talks about how cultural intelligence allows us to rally around a shared problem that we all care about, and then to actually find that our differences are often the best ways to resolve those problems. So I think that would be the one thing I'd want to say to people, that the overcoming polarization doesn't mean diminishing our differences. It's actually to elevate it, but it's not just that, it's then having a strategy through cultural intelligence to help us use those differences to come to solutions that will benefit all of us.
Yeah, and you just summed up in that one big takeaway why I was so excited to have you have this conversation with you, because that's the thing that I keep saying to folks all the time. If you learn how to value difference, it opens the door for very productive conversations about tough, difficult, challenging, brave issues. So I really appreciate that. Thank you for being on Inclusion Solutions and sharing what your perspective and you research with the book. We have been talking to Dr. David Livermore, who is the author of a new book that's coming out. It should be out by the time you see this video. A new book, Digital, Diverse, and Divided. You can see the cover on the shelf behind him, so you know what to look for in the bookstore or online. And I really encourage you to take a look at this. And he's been sharing with us his perspective on the evolution of CQ, how it can be used in a broad range of cross-cultural, microcultural kinds of areas, whether it's in the workplace or in our families, in our neighborhoods, in our communities. And I'm so grateful that you were able to take the time to share with us today, David. Appreciate it so much.
Thank you, Andre. Truly a delight.